This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Neat Sahone and it's Monday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. At least that's normally what I do. Sometimes I like to do something a little bit different, and that's what we're doing today, with a look at what would otherwise be great cycles of cards, but are held back by one card within the cycle being terrible. In Magic, a cycle is a collection of cards that are tied together either mechanically or thematically. The typical cycle is 5 cards, with each color receiving 1 card in the cycle. Cycles have been around as long as Magic has, with several of them appearing in Alpha. The 5 Moxen are a cycle, for example, as are the 5 basic lands. In last week's video, I took a look at bad cycles that have a single standout card, so today's video is something of a mirror image of that, because we'll be taking a look at cycles that have 4 excellent cards and 1 dud. This video is based on my own opinion, but I used some data to help me make selections. A card could only make this list if it has performed substantially worse than the other 4 cards in the cycle. For a card to make this list, there are a few things that have to be true. First, it has to have had either no success or very limited success at Magic's highest level of competition. Meanwhile, the other cards in the cycle have outperformed it by a wide margin. Additionally, a card can't be on this list if it's widely played in EDH, and this of course also means that the other cards in the cycle have to be played significantly more in the format. Alright, with all those explanations out of the way, let's get to the list. At number 10, I have Pulse of the Dross, which is part of a cycle of pulses from Darksteel. They are all instants and sorceries that do a thing, and then if a certain condition is met related to that thing, they return to your hand. This can be pretty spicy if the card you're casting is doing something impressive. Admittedly, none of the cards in this cycle are great, with none of them seeing a whole lot of play in EDH and only seeing a bit of play in Premier level competitive Magic, and that's why this is held to number 10, since the cycle as a whole isn't super impressive, but Pulse of the Dross is still way worse than the other 4 cards in the cycle. That's generally because the other 4 can be pretty useful in the right deck or the right situation. Pulse of the Fields gains you life, Pulse of the Forge damages your opponent, Pulse of the Grid draws you cards, and Pulse of the Tangle gives you a beast token. Meanwhile, Pulse of the Dross makes your opponent discard a card. That's not a great deal for 3 mana as it is, and sure, you disrupt your opponent, but it just costs too much mana for a very unimpressive effect. One big problem discard spells always have is that their usefulness wanes as the game goes on. If you're behind with the other pulses, there's a good chance that they'll help you get back in the game if you draw them late. Pulse of the Forge and Pulse of the Fields alter the damage race, Pulse of the Grid finds you more action, and Pulse of the Tangle actually adds to your board. Pulse of the Dross is useless in those situations, and that's a big part of what makes it way worse than the rest of the cycle. At number 9, I have Helltooth Hollow, which is part of a cycle of rare lands with Hideaway in Lorwyn. They all let you tuck away a card from the top 4 cards of your library, and then when you meet some condition, you can pay some mana to cast the card for free. Obviously, the idea here is very powerful, as it's a land that not only nets you a card, but a free card. For most of the cards in the cycle, you have complete control over the condition to cast the card. Windbrisk Heights wants you to attack with 3 or more creatures, Spinerock Knoll wants you to do 7 or more damage to your opponent, Mosswort Bridge wants you to have creatures with total power 10 or greater, and Shelldock Isle does its thing if your library has 20 or fewer cards. You can sort of build decks around all of those and get them going without too much effort. Windbrisk Heights, Spinerock Knoll, and Mosswort Bridge are all heavily played in EDH because the upside is a pretty big deal and not that difficult to obtain. Shelldock Isle is the worst of the bunch in EDH since your deck is larger in that format, but all 4 of these have also found at least some success at Magic's highest level of competition. Meanwhile, Helltooth Hollow is played even less in EDH than the Isle, and it has 0 Premier Event top 8s. The main problem the Hollow has is that you don't have control over meeting the condition to cast the card for free. The Hollow wants you and your opponent to have 0 cards in hand. That's just a challenging thing to meet unless you're a very dedicated discard deck, but even then, you'll be surprised how difficult it is to get the Hollow to do its thing. Oftentimes, Helltooth Hollow feels like a downgraded swamp, and you don't really want that in any format. At number 8, I've got Teferi's Isle. The Isle is part of a cycle a bit different from the other ones I've talked about in these cycle MTG top 10s, and that's because the 5 cards in this cycle are not from the same set. In fact, none of these cards appeared in a single set together, with each one appearing in a different set. Wizards calls this type of cycle a mega cycle. Despite all the time between them, the people who made each of these cards all intended on making them part of a cycle of legendary lands that would either add colored mana or use a colored activated ability. Anyway, Teferi's Isle is a land with phasing. It kind of makes up for this by being able to add 2 blue mana instead of just 1, but phasing is still a pretty big downside to have on a land. Meanwhile, the other 4 cards in the cycle are utility lands with very nice activated abilities. Core Haven can prevent damage, Keldon Necropolis can do damage, Yavimaya Hollow can regenerate creatures, and Volrath's Stronghold can help you redraw powerful creatures that are in your graveyard. Sure, they all only tap for colorless mana, but the abilities they offer are pretty nice things to have on lands. Keldon Necropolis is definitely the weakest of the 4 other cards in the cycle, as its activated ability is pretty pricey, but it still gives you some very nice reach and can pick off small creatures. Meanwhile, Teferi's Isle is just producing mana and only every other turn. The other lands in this cycle just give you way more value, and that's why they're played more in EDH and have been more successful in Tournament Magic too. At number 7, I have Frantic Purification. It's part of a cycle of commons from Torment that all have madness. On the face of it, Frantic Purification doesn't look like a terrible card. After all, 1 white mana to blow up an enchantment isn't bad, especially when you can still cast it if you discard it. But the problem is that the upside of this over other enchantment hate cards just isn't enough to make this worth running in any formats. Meanwhile, the other cards in this cycle give you some pretty nice value. Obsessive Search lets you draw a card even if you discard it. Psychotic Haze can deal with X1s pretty efficiently. Fiery Temper becomes Lightning Bolt when you discard it. And Basking Rootwalla becomes a free creature. The payoffs for discarding these are just way bigger, and the cards themselves are generally more useful in broader situations. They're all played far more in EDH, in addition to finding success in competitive Magic. At number 6, it is Tolaria, which is part of another cycle of legendary lands. Fittingly enough, this cycle came from Legends. They are all lands that enter the battlefield untapped, can tap for colored mana, and they can tap for another effect too. Because these are all essentially basic lands with upside, they don't really need to do a whole lot to be worth playing. Pendelhaven and Karakas are both pretty famous cards that have been played a ton over the years. Pendelhaven is great in any green deck that has lots of 1/1s, and Karakas is a nice way to bounce opposing legendary creatures, or bounce your own for value. Meanwhile, Tolaria, Urborg, and Hammerheim allow you to turn off keyword abilities, which is kind of cool. Urborg is the best of those 3 as it turns off First Strike and Swamp Walk. Hammerheim turns off Land Walk, which is less useful, but still something that will come up sometimes. Tolaria's problem is that it turns off Banding, a mechanic that appears on very few cards and sees virtually no play, so there's really no reason to run the land, even though it's basically an island with upside. Apart from Hammerheim, the other lands in this cycle have seen at least some play in competitive Magic, with Pendelhaven and Karakas being 2 of the best lands ever. For reference, Karakas came in at number 1 on my MTG top 10 that looked at white lands, and Pendelhaven was number 2 in the MTG top 10 that looked at green ones. Additionally, the ones that aren't banned in EDH also see significant play in that format. Karakas is banned in the format, as obviously bouncing legendaries in that format would be a bit too good. So yeah, this is a very unbalanced cycle, with Tolaria just being a useless land. At number 5, I've got Vine Dryad. It's part of a cycle of rare pitch spells from Mercadian Masks. In other words, you can cast them for free if you exile a card from your hand of the right color. Vine Dryad is not very impressive, even when you cast her for free. It isn't worth 2 for 1ing yourself for a 1/3 with Forest Walk, even if it does have flash. It isn't like a 1/3 body is really going to get in the way very much. Meanwhile, the other cards in this cycle can do some pretty impressive stuff. Reverent Mantra can give your whole board protection from a chosen color, Misdirection lets you hijack an opposing spell, Unmask lets you disrupt your opponent's hand, and Cave-In lets you do 2 damage to all players and creatures. Those are all cards that have incredibly swingy effects, so being able to use them when you have no mana is pretty great. You can't really say that about Vine Dryad. Admittedly, apart from Misdirection, none of these cards are seeing a ton of play in EDH, but they are all still seeing way more play in the format than the Dryad is, and that, coupled with the fact that they were all played in competitive Magic at one point or another, is enough to make Vine Dryad look pretty bad next to the other cards in its cycle. At number 5, I have Intervention Pact, which is part of the Pact cycle from Future Sight. They are all instants that cost 0 mana, but require you to pay mana at the beginning of your next upkeep, otherwise you lose the game. Pact of Negation is a free counterspell, Slaughter Pact is a free kill spell, Summoner's Pact is a free creature tutor, and Pact of the Titan gives you a free 4/4. Meanwhile, Intervention Pact prevents damage from a single source. And sure, you also get to gain some life, but overall the Pact is still not especially good. I think the biggest thing is just how situational it is. In the exact right situation, Intervention Pact does a nice job of saving you, but the situation where a single card is going to do enough to kill you really isn't that common. Plus, it's not like it necessarily deals with whatever it is that damaged you either. You just prevent the damage. It's kind of like a fog effect. The other packs are far more useful in more situations. And sure, Pact of the Titan does feel like a step down from the other three, but it is played more in EDH and has had success at Magic's highest level of competition, so Intervention Pact's resume is significantly less impressive than Pact of the Titan, and way less impressive than the others in the cycle. At number 3 I have Marrow Shards, which is part of a cycle of uncommon cards with a mana value of 1 that cost Phyrexian mana. Phyrexian mana means you can pay either a single colored mana or 2 life. So, like the Vine Dryad cycle, this is another cycle where all the spells can be free. Well, sort of. Postmortem Lunge isn't entirely free in most cases, but still. Gutshot does 1 damage for 0 mana, Mental Misstep is a free counterspell, Noxious Revival can allow you to put a card from your graveyard on top of your library, and Postmortem Lunge lets you temporarily reanimate a creature. Gutshot and Mental Misstep are 2 cards that have been multi-format all-stars, and while Postmortem Lunge and Noxious Revival have had more limited success due to the fact that they simply don't have the most powerful of effects, the fact that you can pay life instead of mana for them has still allowed them to see significant play. Meanwhile, Marrow Shards can do 1 damage to attacking creatures. Yeah, that's an incredibly narrow and situational effect, and isn't going to be impactful in a whole lot of board states, so it doesn't really matter that you can play it without paying any mana. It's almost like they were looking at Phyrexian mana and thinking, whoa, this is too powerful. We better downgrade Marrow Shards. But of course, they didn't downgrade any of the other super busted cards that use the mechanic. In addition to success in competitive Magic, both Noxious Revival and Mental Misstep see a massive amount of play in EDH, with each of them appearing in roughly 8% of all decks on EDH Rec. The other cards in the cycle are no slouches either. Postmortem Lunge is the lowest, and it still appears in almost 700 decks. At number 2, it is Scars of the Veteran, which is part of another cycle of potentially free spells. This one appeared in Alliances, and all the cards in this cycle let you exile a card of a matching color to cast a spell for free. Of the cycle, Force of Will is certainly the most well-known. It has a reasonable argument as the best counterspell ever, as it is heavily played in the Eternal formats and EDH. In the latter, 13% of all the decks in EDH Rec feature Force of Will, which is a pretty incredible number. The other cards in this cycle have also found significant success, even if Force of Will does outshine them significantly. Pyrokinesis lets you do 4 damage divided as you choose, Contagion lets you put -2/-1 counters on opposing creatures, and Bounty of the Hunt lets you put +1/+1 counters on 3 creatures. Sure, Bounty doesn't look that great compared to the other 3, but it does have 1 Pro Tour top 8 and is still substantially better than Scars, which lets you prevent 7 damage that is done to any target, and if that target is a creature, that creature gets +0/+1 counters at the end of the turn. Kind of like we saw with Intervention Pact, this type of damage prevention effect is just way too narrow, even if you are getting it for no mana. It's pretty stunning that Scars of the Veteran appears in only 23 decks on all of EDH Rec. And at number 1, I've got Healing Salve. You probably saw this one coming, especially if you watched last week's top 10 on good cards in bad cycles, as I briefly made mention of this cycle in my introduction. So, this is one of the game's first cycles appearing in Alpha, called the Boon Cycle. They all cost 1 mana and give you an effect that involves the number 3. Dark Ritual gives you 3 black mana, Giant Growth gives a creature +3/+3, Lightning Bolt does 3 damage, and Ancestral Recall draws you 3 cards. And yeah, Ancestral Recall is one of the most powerful cards ever printed and part of the Power 9 for a reason, but the other cards in this cycle are also quite good. Giant Growth used to be a pretty heavily played combat trick, Dark Ritual is still pivotal for decks like Storm, and Lightning Bolt is probably the best burn spell ever printed. And then you have Healing Salve, which gives you an option of 2 different things. The others don't do that right, but those things are preventing 3 damage and gaining you 3 life. Yeah, that wouldn't be a good card either way, but when put next to the other cards in this cycle, it's just silly. Ancestral Recall is banned in EDH, and the other cards all see significant play there, with Dark Ritual and Lightning Bolt being pretty close to staples. Even with a 0 in the mix, the rest of the cycle appears in an average of 19,509 EDH decks on EDH Rec, while Healing Salve is in 64. For most of the cards on this list, you've seen a major difference in price between the bad card in the cycle and the other 4 cards, but it's definitely the most pronounced here. Even an Alpha Healing Salve is only worth $34.99. Ancestral Recall is worth an insane $240,000 because it's part of the Power 9, but even the other non-Power 9 cards in this cycle are worth a ton compared to the Salve. Lightning Bolt is at $850, Dark Ritual is at $350, and Giant Growth is $75. So, yeah, Healing Salve is a really bad card, and the other 4 cards in the cycle are some of the most iconic cards in the game. That's how it ended up being number 1 on this list. Well, those are my picks for the 10 worst cards in really good cycles. If you want to own any of the cards that appeared in this video, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link, taking you to their store for each and every card you saw. If you enjoyed this video, do me a favor and like it and share it so that it gets out there and more people can see it. If you want to make sure you stay aware of future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. If you want to catch up on past MTG Top 10s, and there's over 400 of them at this point, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. And lastly, if you want to go the extra mile in supporting the channel, you can do that on Patreon. Thanks for watching.